And in the interest of time, let me just jump in and say that what I had planned to do tonight was to, at request, provide UUP with some background to the current discussion among Unitarian Universalists about what is known as the eighth principle. And I think most Unitarian Universalists these days understand that we have been operating for some time under a statement of principles and purposes that cites 7 principles and 6 sources of those principles. Roughly since the pandemic and the death of George Floyd, there's been a real upsurge in the denomination of a discussion of should we have an 8th principle that has to do with dismantling the unacknowledged supremacy, the unacknowledged white supremacy in our culture and in the denomination generally. And what I've been asked to do is to provide you some background to all of that. And I'm going to try to do that. And also, this is being recorded so that it will be available to everyone. But I'm calling it our imperfect history, this first session. It has to do with our Unitarian Universalist heritage of struggling for racial, gender, and social justice in America. And I think many of you know that I've written a couple of books on this subject. I can't get the slides up, but one of them is about providing an anti-oppression analysis of Unitarian Universalist history. I begin by saying that all predominantly white U.S. groups that I know of have been at best able to achieve a mixed history of dealing with oppression. And that includes UUs. But I want to review briefly our role in challenging racism, sexism, and homophobia. I suggest, as background reading, a couple of books that, frankly, I've written. One is a history of Universalists and Unitarians in America, a people's history. And the other is my more recent book about the Transcendentalists and how they sparked the American struggle for racial, gender, and social justice. I want you to notice that I'm wearing my Universalist Herald t-shirt.
Awesome. Great.
It's the oldest liberal religious publication in North America.
Wow.
And I'm glad that a few more people have joined us. I want to say that it's important for people who study our denominational history. Both Unitarians and Universalists emerged from the era of the American Revolution. Yet they were separated by social class. And that's important for us to understand. Early Unitarians were led by merchant class property owners. They followed Harvard-educated clergy. And Universalists were mostly farmers, artisans, fishermen, tradesmen, and other upwardly mobile workers who followed self-educated clergy. The first president of the UUA, Dana McLean Greeley, in the 1960s, said that it took 150 years for Unitarians and Universalists to combine because they constituted, as he put it, 2 different sets of cousins, each of very interrelated clergy and their families and networks among their lay congregants. I also want to say that part of what I want to lay as a background to our undertaking this daunting effort to commit ourselves to roll back a culture of white supremacy is that to every heroic effort in that regard, there are both revolutionary examples and counter-revolutionary examples. Take, for example, Philadelphia Universalist Benjamin Rush, physician, signer of the Declaration, founder of the Society for the Abolition of Slavery in Pennsylvania. And yet the most recent biography of him that I've studied, and which I'm going to try to update on our online website called Dictionary of Unitarian and Universalist Biographies, is that he once owned a slave. The question is why? It may be that he bought that person in order to free him. That would be a very typical suggestion of the 1790s. He also said some really weird things about skin pigmentation and whether it was related to leprosy. And I still haven't figured out whether he thought that whites suffered from the leprosy or blacks did. And then there's Thomas Jefferson, self-declared Unitarian without a congregation, who writes a declaration that says that all men are created equal, yet he was clearly an enslaver who didn't free his own slaves when he died, the way Washington did, even though some of those that he had fathered. And yet, Frederick Douglass, the leading Black abolitionist of the 19th century, chose to embrace Jefferson's declaration and ignore his deeds, despite the fact that Jefferson had said, our religion is written not in our words, but in our deeds. And finally, Unitarian John Adams, whose Massachusetts Constitution echoed the Declaration. And it took the courts to end slavery, and jumping way ahead, allow gay marriage. And it took his wife Abigail to say, remember the ladies. Now, in the Revolutionary era, I think it's very important for us to historically to remember that white anti-slavery efforts were tied up with fears of slave rebellion. After all, the French Revolution in 1791 led to the revolution in Haiti, which was then a French colony, that resulted in the deaths of many white plantation owners, and then, ironically, provokes Napoleon to sell Louisiana to the United States as a place where we can expand slavery. In the same period, the British abolitionist movement is succeeding on fear of the same kind of rebellion in places like Jamaica and the Caribbean islands. That is, the British finally give up slavery in their Caribbean colonies because they're afraid of slave rebellion. And it's gradual, and it's compensated emancipation. That is, the British government raised literally millions of pounds to pay off the so-called owners of the enslaved, to grant them their freedom. And then here in the United States, in the early 19th century, you have periodic revolts of enslaved people around Charleston by Denmark Vesey, on Bastille Day in 1822, by Nat Turner in Virginia, which leads the earliest white abolitionists in America to promise not to encourage violence, but to rely only on moral persuasion. When William Lloyd Garrison, launches the Liberator in January of 1831 and the Anti-Slavery Society, it's all about, I will not be silenced, but I also will not encourage anyone to use violence. There's a lot of rhetorical vehemence that condemns not only the sin of enslavement, but also the sinners. So it's pretty Calvinistic or evangelical. And our Unitarian forebears, led by people like William Ellery Channing, didn't much like it. The question then comes, who was an abolitionist? Channing himself really disliked labels. He saw them as a means of self-congratulation. Oh, I'm so smart, I don't believe in the Trinity. Oh, I'm an abolitionist. I'm against slavery, but I'm not going to do anything about it. He was, at the time of his most important work, already suffering from the tuberculosis that killed him at an early age. He died in 1842. From 1835 on, he sent his protege, the German-born Unitarian minister Charles or Karl Fallen, to represent him at anti-slavery meetings. That cost Fallen his job at Harvard, where he was teaching German and theological ethics. And when Fallen tragically died in January of 1841, this is the opening scene of my book on the Transcendentalists and their anti-slavery efforts. The trustees of Channing's own Unitarian Church said that he could not even use the building to conduct a memorial service for Fallen where he had been ordained, because Fallen was too controversial as a radical anti-slavery abolitionist. Channing, to his credit, reacted by preaching about Fallen's death and then declining to accept any more money from the people who were employing him as their minister. He told them that if they wanted him to be dismissed as his pastor, they'd have to say so. But he was still worried about their souls. He died just 2 years later, and his last public address was on Emancipation Day, August 1st, 1842, the 6th anniversary of the British emancipation of the slaves in Jamaica and the Caribbean colonies. It's important also for us to understand that who's an abolitionist is about when, and it was a lot easier to be an abolitionist after 1850, when, as part of the Compromise of 1850 that brought California into the Union as a nominally free state, signed by US President Millard Fillmore of Buffalo, New York, a Unitarian, you had a situation in which basically everybody in the North was required under federal law to return anybody who escaped from slavery to enslavement. This caused, in places like Boston, committees of vigilance to arise. That one was chaired by Unitarian minister Theodore Parker. It aimed at protecting both Black citizens who were nominally free and fugitives coming up from the South alike, and to chase off the slave catchers. Yet, why is our history imperfect? The same commissioner under the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, who was paid to return fugitives, was another Unitarian. By the way, he got paid $10 if he found that the person in question had to be sent back to slavery. Only $5 if he had the hearing and the person was set free. The worst of these occasions was in 1854, when a formerly enslaved man named Anthony Buehrens was captured, taken into custody, and ultimately returned to slavery despite even violent attempts to rescue him on the part of Boston Unitarians and their allies. It happened simultaneously with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which opened the question of, is there going to be enslavement in a place like Kansas, of federal territory, to what was called popular sovereignty. That is, if more pro-slavery people occupied Kansas, they would have it as a slave state. If more free people, a huge battle between immigrants from the North and what were then characterized as border ruffians coming over from Missouri, trying to harass the Free State settlers. They burned Lawrence, Kansas in 1856. By the way, it was named for a Boston Unitarian named Abbott Lawrence, who, when he dealt with the Anthony Buehrens thing, said, "What we woke up having been old-fashioned pro-slavery cotton Whigs and became radical abolitionists." He funded the Free State people who moved to Kansas. This is also the period when John Brown, who most of you have heard about, comes to Kansas to fight against slavery. He is a really Old Testament-like Calvinist who's quite violent and takes part in what becomes known as the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, where he and his sons simply go out and, in reaction to the burning of Lawrence, Kansas, indiscriminately kill about half a dozen pro-slavery people. On the other hand, you have people who come behind Brown, called the Secret Six, who back his plans for freeing more slaves, whether he takes them up from Missouri to Iowa or takes them from Virginia into Pennsylvania. This is Brown's plan, which he only sort of vaguely alludes to for a variety of reasons, that culminates in Harper's Ferry in 1859. But the Secret Six are 5 Boston area Unitarians: Theodore Parker, the physician Samuel Gridley Howe, Reverend Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a wealthy Unitarian who is a follower of Parker's named George Stearns, and Franklin Sanford, the schoolmaster in Concord, plus Garrett Smith in upstate New York, who is a cousin to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. We come up on the Civil War. It's brought about primarily by the decision of the Dred Scott matter before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1857. I think that is the single most important thing. If you want to divide this country, have a Supreme Court that becomes completely subservient to an oppressive regime. The Dred Scott decision said that this enslaved man, who had been brought by his owner, I'm using air quotes, into Minnesota, had no right to sue for his freedom, even though he'd been housed in free territory for years, and that people of color could never claim to be citizens. 7-2. And then, of course, there was Brown's raid that failed on the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Don't get me going about how complicated the motivations behind that were, how even the wisest anti-slavery activists like Frederick Douglass said it was a bad plan. But there's also the 4-way presidential election of 1860. And here in California, we should remember that Abraham Lincoln carried our state by only 700 votes. Thomas Starr King, the new Unitarian minister in San Francisco, was the state's strongest anti-slavery voice. And even before the election, after he went up to Yosemite, he returned to address the Black citizens of San Francisco on Emancipation Day, August the 1st, 1860, and people wept. He was primarily a fundraiser for the U.S. Sanitary Commission, the largest volunteer effort to that point in U.S. history, organized by Unitarians, supported by Universalists. And I think it's important for us to understand that the peak moments of Unitarian Universalist influence in American society came when we were out there in times of conflict. It was during the 1860s, at the height of the U.S. Civil War. The Vice President of the United States, Hannibal Hamlin, was a Unitarian. There were 6 Unitarian or Universalist senators in the Senate. The Dean of the House of Representatives was a Universalist from Illinois, who, by the way, was the sort of congressional sponsor of Ulysses Grant. It's also, from my perspective as a historian, remarkable that the next peak of Unitarian Universalist influence is in the 1960s, during the Civil Rights struggle and the anti-war movement. I think about the Selma campaign, where the interfaith presence of Jewish leaders, Protestant leaders, Catholic leaders was all organized from 25 Beacon Street by Dana McLean Greeley and his staff. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was the Ware lecturer at our General Assembly in 1965, heard by my good friend and successor as UUA president, Bill Sinkford. Our anti-war activity and the publication of the Pentagon Papers by Beacon Press was a truly heroic moment in our movement. Cost us a lot. There are, of course, also low points in Unitarian and Universalist history. Going back to just after the Civil War, when we slide into what's known as the Gilded Age, I think about Universalist women who organized the Centennial Convocation of Universalists on Cape Ann, Massachusetts in 1870, remembering when John Murray first came to America. They organized it, the male leaders dominated it, and tried to get all of the money left over. The women, bless their hearts, refused to give it up and stayed independent. I think about AUA President Samuel Eliot, whose father was the president of Harvard, a transformative educational leader, Charles Eliot. But from 1900 to 1926, as the president of the American Unitarian Association, Sam Eliot opposed having women in the ministry, despite the good work of women ministers in places like Iowa, the Iowa Sisterhood. And then out here on the West Coast, you have Stanford president, Unitarian, David Starr Jordan. He picked his own middle name to name himself after Thomas Starr King. And yet, what did he do? He supported eugenics. The idea that only the strong and the vibrant and the male should reproduce. His book on the topic was published by our own Beacon Press. And this could be possibly the lowest point. In the 1920s, the Universalist side of our movement was infiltrated, because it was more working class, by people who came from the KKK. and at least two Universalist congregations, one in Indiana and one in Massachusetts, were literally taken over by the Ku Klux Klan. This is the downside, by the way, of congregational polity. You have to be careful about whether the people really embrace your deepest values. The next phase I want to talk about is about Universalist decline and Unitarian Renaissance. I think the Universalists declined in part because of poor organization. Their so-called state conventions really didn't control the local congregations and never succeeded in raising much money. They had weakening appeal with their no hell message, and the location of many of their churches in rural communities didn't help either. 40% of all the Universalist churches in America closed during the Great Depression. Unitarians also lost many of their churches during that period, but they undertook a commission on appraisal that led to a so-called Unitarian Renaissance that began in 1937 under new AUA President Frederick May Elliott, and really flourished after World War II, when we founded 500 new congregations, mostly lay-led fellowships. Both denominations were rejected for membership in the new National Council of Churches of Jesus Christ in the United States. Note the latter part of that title. And formed an alternative council of liberal churches to do joint publications and youth work. During this period, of course, one of the things that had happened was that religious humanism had arisen in both movements, primarily on the Unitarian side. The majority of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto of 1933 were Unitarian ministers, along with philosophers led by John Dewey, the great educator and pragmatist, and one Universalist, the late Dr. Clinton Lee Scott. I once presided at the christening of his great-grandchild. There were no people of color among the humanists, however, on the manifesto, despite their advocacy for worldwide egalitarian society based on voluntary cooperation. And it was the group of Universalist humanists around Scott who called themselves the Humiliati, despite being anything but humble, who adroitly began to maneuver for the Universalists to consolidate with the Unitarians. The Unitarians under Fred Elliott were welcoming. They offered ministerial fellowship to all Universalist ministers in good standing. So one of the things that I'm trying to lead up to here is that you should understand this background of the formation of our present denomination, which dates to only 1961. So just over 60 years ago. They went through a 2-year process of all of the congregations in both denominations voting on whether merger was a good idea. It was overwhelmingly positive on both sides, but I began my ministerial career in the Unitarian Church in Knoxville, Tennessee, which had been very involved in the anti-racist movement starting from its founding in 1949, when they set up an interracial day camp that had to hide itself from the Klan, and then came out with a big statement in 1954 about how we've been having our kids meet with one another across racial lines for 5 years now. Don't be afraid. Desegregate the schools, as this court has said, with all deliberate speed. But because one of their founding members was African American, he was sent out to go visit some of the Southern Universalist churches in the early 1960s. And he came back and reported, there's nothing but a bunch of white country Methodists with the hell scared out of them. They say there ain't no hell, and I'm here to tell you on the basis of my personal experience, the hell there ain't. Ironically, Knoxville, the Tennessee Valley, now UU church, voted against the merger. But it's the only congregation in our movement that ever produced two UUA presidents, me and Robert Nelson West, who took up the deep challenge in 1969. The first president of the UUA was Dana McLean Greeley, who had promised as the outgoing president of the American Unitarians that he wouldn't run. But when he saw that the chair of the merger commission, a Universalist, was not very articulate, jumped in anyway and won. Many of us have inherited hymns and songs from the hymnal that was produced during this time. Hymns for the Celebration of Life, 1963, the old blue hymnal, which was chaired by the Universalist humanist Kenneth Patton. I've got a slide in my stack here about the 1961 principles and purposes of the UUA. There were 6. But I'm not going to repeat those today because we're going to deal with principles and purposes in the second session of this course. I will go on to say that in the 1960s, one of the things that happened between Unitarians and Universalists in trying to forge a more united movement was that Dana spent a lot of money on things like the Selma campaign, a slick magazine, his presence at Vatican II, his contacts with global leaders around the world. And in 1968, when the UUA General Assembly voted to give $1 million, translate that to maybe 6, 8, maybe even $10 million today, to the Racial Justice Fund led by the Black Affairs Council, what was discovered was that the UUA was, by 1968, pretty near bankruptcy. Everybody was paying attention to politics. Nobody was paying attention to religion. They had a mortgage on the headquarters building. The UUA General Council advised the board that only they could distribute funds, not the General Assembly. That when it came to budgetary matters, the General Assembly was merely advisory. And when in 1969, the General Assembly learned that only $200,000 was going to be dispersed to the Black Affairs Council, not the $250,000 promised, there was a walkout at the General Assembly by both the Black Affairs Council and the white allies that called themselves fullback. I was there. It was my first UUA General Assembly. I hadn't even declared myself to be a Unitarian yet. New UUA President Robert Nelson West had to cut field staff from 22 to 8. What got us through the 1970s was a rescue from the North Shore Unitarian Society of Plandome, New York, now known as Shelter Rock, a group that has benefited just enormously from inheriting stock in a holding company that holds the royalty rights on oil and gas in the German part of the North Sea. Irony. They matched the donations of every other congregation. I came into the ministry in the 1970s. every progressive religious group in America, from Reform Judaism through the United Methodists, through progressive Catholicism to us, lost a third of its members. There was a retreat from social engagement, a rise of individualistic New Age spirituality, a tremendous increase due to the sexual revolution of divorces, misconduct, self-involvement, and liberal religious youth in our movement chose to break ties with the UUA itself and become autonomous. The Women's Federation demanded that the sexist language in the original UUA bylaws, which was all about man this and man that, be revised along with the hymnal. And Black nationalism caused many African American UUs to either withdraw or re-engage with the historic African American churches from which they had come. Only in the 1980s did Unitarian Universalism begin to grow again, and primarily in the Sun Belt, especially in retirement communities. Urban churches, I was part of the Urban Church Coalition, sought support for greater racial diversity efforts. An extension program funded by that congregation on Long Island turned many small fellowships into small pastoral congregations with ministers. Santa Rosa falls into that category. There were efforts to establish new congregations focused on people of color in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Washington, Atlanta, Chicago, Tulsa. I have to say there weren't very many enduring successes, although it did result in the recruitment of more clergy of color. And finally, primarily through the pushing of the women in the association, the adoption of a new statement of principles and purposes. I want to say a few words about the diversification of leadership in our movement. Frankly, I thought I could never become a UUA president because I wasn't a Boston Brahmin. And I'm a little bit proud that when I was president, the first people of color came on the UUA senior staff, starting in 1993-94. And that I was succeeded by one of the people that I had chosen, William Singford, who did a remarkable job with our work of extension and congregational services. But I became very sad in 2009 in the wake of the Great Recession, when the second UUA president, who is a person of color, Peter Morales, had to deal with a board that was genuinely hostile to him. And when there was a controversy over the selection of senior staff in 2017, Peter felt himself compelled to resign. This was a true low point in our dealing with issues of diversity. And it resulted in a transitional co-presidency led by former President Bill Singford, Dr. Leon Spencer, an African-American lay leader who had been on the board during my time and came from the Savannah area of Georgia, and the Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt. Some of you may know that our current UUA president, Susan Frederick Gray, was elected in the wake of this mess. I've spoken with her. I admire what she's done with a very difficult time. One of the things that she has done is that almost the majority of the senior staff of our movement are now people of color. The nominating committee for UUA president invited 2 people to become candidates to succeed Susan. Sophia Betancourt is now the unopposed candidate to succeed Susan. I also want to say a few words about Unitarian Universalism and the challenge to heterosexism. All the way back in the 19th century, I think there was a quiet tolerance among our liberals for same-sex relations. I think about what were called Boston marriages between two women, you know. But there was, in the early 20th century, a lot of participation, even among Unitarians, in cultural suppression of sexual expression of any sort. Some support for people like Margaret Sanger in trying to do her work in Planned Parenthood, but I don't know if this is going to surprise you. She was also part of the eugenics movement. By the early 1950s, we were doing some of the very first religious blessings of same-sex unions. I discovered in doing my research about the history of the congregation here in San Francisco that Harry Schofield probably did the first same-sex union blessing out here as early as 1957. Denominational support for things like that came along in the early 70s when I was just coming into ministry, when we were also establishing the first denominational Office of Gay Affairs, opposed only by heterosexists who said, we've always arranged our own, why shouldn't they? I remember that conversation at a General Assembly. We were the first religious group in America to support equal civil marriage when I was president in 1995, and I could tell you that whole story. And then in the great Massachusetts Supreme Court case, Goodrich versus Massachusetts, it was Unitarian Universalist couples, led by my good friend, the Goodriches, who established the first legal right to equal marriage. And when I finished my time as UUA president, I spent the next decade as national co-chair of Freedom to Marry, a equal rights effort that I think triumphed more rapidly than we could have ever expected. Partly because non-gay allies helped to reframe the issue, not as a matter of rights, but as a matter of fairness. But I also want to make mention of some chronic blind spots in our anti-oppression work. Perhaps the deepest on my conscience is that of indigenous rights. I think somewhere we have to remember that if you scratch a Unitarian or a Universalist, you're likely to find somebody who is still reacting against the dominant culture in our country, which is Calvinist. It's fatalist. It believes in predestination. And if there has been one area of non-activism on our part, I think it has been around predestination thinking about indigenous rights, that they are simply fated to fade with few exceptions. The good news is that many of our historic congregations are really coming to reckon with this, especially the Massachusetts congregations, who realize in places from Plymouth to Andover that they were founded on native land. People who are now serving with what is known as the Indian Society, believe it or not, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel to the Indians of North America and others. I was one of their trustees for a while, controlled by Unitarians and a few Congregationalists, the oldest philanthropy in North America, funding indigenous rights organizations. And then back in the 1830s, you had people like Emerson protesting against the Cherokee removal. Out here in California in the 1850s, 1859, young Unitarian journalist and writer Bret Harte courageously stood up against the slaughter of the coastal Miwok people in Humboldt. I can tell you that story. In the 1870s, a Unitarian, when the US government decided to parcel out the responsibility for the various tribal reservations around the country to different denominations so that the religious folks would stop complaining about the human rights abuses. Unitarian Reverend Jabez Trask went to the Western Utes of Colorado and did the wisest thing he possibly could have done. He just sat down and watched them. They were doing fine. He put the money that had been given to him in the bank in case any of the Utes ever wanted to go to college. But there was a long forgetfulness in the early 20th century, a lot of ethnocentrism. I think of AUA moderator William Howard Taft, President, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and in between those two roles, Governor General of the Philippines, trying to Westernize and Christianize even the indigenous people of that country. Or the mission to the Blackfoot tribe of Montana that began in the 1880s and 90s. When I first came into the movement, there was a representative of that group who was still grateful for the school that the Unitarians had made far more benevolent than many other mission schools, and who would show up at General Assembly in full regalia to thank us for what we had done. But it also reminds me that the last source of Unitarian Universalist spirituality that was added to our statement of principles and purposes came in acknowledgement of the neglect of earth-centered spirituality and lessons from Native American or indigenous peoples, 1995, while I was president. Today, I want you to know that there are real efforts at remembrance and reparation going on all over the denomination. I think of my friends at the Old North Parish in Andover, Massachusetts, acknowledging that they sit on land that was stolen. Or the largest Unitarian church in North America at All Souls in Tulsa, remembering that one of their own lay members literally stirred up the 1922 Tulsa race riot. Or the congregation in Boston, Massachusetts at King's Chapel, which is now trying to devote as much as $5 million of their endowment to a physical memorial remembering the people who were enslaved by their pre-revolutionary owners who built that church, and to set up a living memorial that would be a partnership with people of color and organizations in the city. All of this is stuff that I just offer as background for our considering why we should pay attention to what is being proposed as an eighth principle to Unitarian Universalism, namely a commitment on behalf of all of us to acknowledge that there is a dominant culture of white supremacy, not only beyond our walls, but within ourselves, within our own thinking, our own acting, our own congregational process if we are not careful. And that we need to figure out what kind of commitment are we willing to make to undo this legacy of white supremacy? I do not consider this to be an easy thing. Individual change of consciousness is one thing. I've seen it over and over. I've helped more people than I can count do things like decide to go into recovery. Group changes of consciousness come harder, much harder. There's always resistance. And finally, let's just face it, culture change is evolutionary. In some respects, it's almost glacial. We shouldn't expect that we can change an entire culture by simply signing an agreement or saying that we will try. It will be tremendously important for us to manage our own expectations of what we can do in ourselves, among ourselves, or beyond ourselves. So with that, I will stop and really, really welcome whatever responses and questions in this. This is not what I had planned. Technological difficulties have intervened. I will take all kinds of input from people after the recording and just open a dialogue, which I think will go on for the next 4 months. But how are we going to do this? How are we going to respond as Unitarian Universalists in Petaluma? I want you to understand that I am not here to tell you how to think. I'm simply here to present you with some history, some contemporary challenges coming from our fellow Unitarian Universalists, and to open a dialogue among us all. And with that, I'll shut up and invite people to raise their hands in the chat or open their mics and take me on.
Karen, you need to unmute there.
I'm sorry, I was reading Jan's text in the chat to Gil that her mom went to Selma on a train with the UUs.
Mm.
Many of us probably have Selma stories.
Where was your mom then, Jan?
She went with a group from Washington, and went down that call to join in the march.
Yeah.
And she
We
actually
had the largest representation of any religious group at Selma.
Yeah, I was raised on that, and she actually stood near Martin Luther King Jr. for his speech on the steps. So that was a frequently shared.
Yeah.
Plus, they were very active in Northern Virginia. My parents went door to door with their congregation to different homes, trying to integrate the neighborhood. So there's a lot of action there. And thank you, John. That was a good history. I was familiar with quite a bit of it, but new pieces and stuff of just, I remember all the Unitarian presidents, but I forgot how many like other representatives there were and vice president and all.
Suzanne, unmute. You've got your hand up.
Thank you. I'm always interested in learning about Unitarians and Universalists. I think it's just so fascinating. And as Jan said, I know quite a few of them, but not really as many as I'd like to. And I also know that sometimes there are, I'm not sure if they're mistakes or whatever it is, but like Susan B. Anthony sometimes and Dorothea Dix are called Quakers instead of Unitarians. And I'm curious to know how that's actually proven, was one thing. And the other thing, I think the number one way that we could really grow UUism is if PBS made a series on famous UUs. So those are two parts to give you. And now you're muted, John, I think.
Ooh, yeah, here we go. So let me just say about Susan B. Anthony. She was a Quaker by birth, but she left the Quakers because they couldn't come to consensus about things like anti-racism. And so she joined the Unitarian congregation in Rochester, New York.
And Dorothea Dix was a Catholic, I believe.
No, she was a Unitarian from birth.
Oh, was she? Okay, cool.
Yeah. And one of the true heroes of the attempt to provide decent mental health care in the United States. Channing sent her as a member of his congregation into doing what one of his male seminarians had failed at, be a chaplain in a jail. And what she found there was that half of the people were being incarcerated, not because they had committed a crime, but because they suffered from severe mental illness. And that sent her off on her lifelong crusade for decent mental health care. By the way, we need a new Dorothy Dix, because what is happening today is that we are incarcerating people with mental illness, and we are not providing the kind of care that is required. But that's another whole story, isn't it? So yeah, we have some great heroes, but I've also tried to emphasize that never should we just pat ourselves on the back for what has been accomplished in the past, nor should we assume that what our forebears did was 100% pure. There were many blind spots all along the way, and we probably have our own. And one of the things that they didn't do often enough, but I would say Dorothea Dix exemplifies, is they actually listened to the people who were being unjustly incarcerated or treated poorly. And the first step in our being more liberatory in our practice and more concerned and more effective is for us to listen to the people who we want to ally ourselves with, who are suffering under various forms of oppression. And it goes on, because while we would advocate power with, power over tends to prevail. And there I'll just shut up and pass it on to somebody else who wants to.
But what about my comment about PBS series? And I'm serious about it.
I pitched my last book to Ken Buehrens.
Well, I mean, I think it would be good.
I
think it would be good
talked with Ken about doing a series on the Transcendentalists.
Mm-hmm.
And he just folded his arms and said, I'm booked for the next 10 years.
Well, then he shouldn't have a monopoly.
Well, unfortunately, the way in which access to PBS or Hollywood or anything else goes, there are only a few doorkeepers.
We need a backer, financial.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. But I think persistence
Mhm.
and telling the stories that matter eventually breaks down certain barriers. And that also the retelling of history as it should be told is something that is our duty. That's why I'm devoting so much of my time in retirement to telling our story a little bit more effectively than I find that it's been told in the past.
Mhm.
Cheryl, you have your
Yes.
hand up and your mic on.
I really enjoyed your talk, and I just did the women's group, and we were talking about Dorothea Dix and
Oh, yeah.
Susan B. Anthony. So it is apropos in the timing. I just want to speak about my own experience. What I've heard is that Sunday morning at church is the most segregated time in our country. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think from my experience. And it's frustrating. We went to the Unitarian Church in Bethesda, Maryland, and raised our kids there. My husband grew up Unitarian in Palo Alto, and his parents were the founders of that church. But all of them were white. There were some Asians, but there were no blacks. And the only time I was exposed to blacks was in the 70s. The LA schools were integrated and some kids were bused. So we had African Americans bused from kind of a middle class Black neighborhood, and then the Asians were middle class, and I would, so it was kind of a third and third, or maybe 25% and 25% and 50%. So it was excellent. I think it's the only way to get people to actually mingle with the other race so that they're not afraid. But I bet all of you, I'd be curious if any of you have went to school with African Americans. Did any of you? Jan did? Yeah. Oh, and well, that's good. I mean, and then I became friends with some, and they're very the Black history is very Christian, and I just unfortunately I think it would be hard for them to feel comfortable in our church. I
All
wish
right,
it was
I'm going to jump in right there
okay.
and
Good.
say that I don't believe that's true.
Okay, I want to hear that.
There's a long history of Black intellectuals who are more humanists than tied to the rhythms of the Black church.
Okay.
And you have at least one of them among your new members in Richard
Chadwick.
Right. Right.
So first, it's a mistake for us to now. Let me just go back and say it was Dr. King who said that it was the most segregated hour in America.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's certainly been my experience growing up.
Mhm.
I went to high school in a small town in Michigan where when I was an exchange student in Italy, my parents took in an African-American exchange student from Uganda.
Mhm.
And only when my parents died did I find all of the hate mail they had received.
Oh.
Um,
Hmm.
yeah.
They hid that from their children
Yeah.
wisely.
Hmm.
We were conscious of trying to transcend some of these barriers, but sociologists will tell you that people sort out their churches on the basis of race, number one, education, number two, and social class. And that's been the case from the beginning of religion in America. We're a very voluntaristic society, but like seeks like.
Yep.
Blessedly, No group that we think of as like, either on the basis of race, class, or education, is entirely alike. So there are people who are very much open to the Unitarian Universalist message, who are not white, not super educated, and not particularly middle class. Now, where are you going to find those people?
Yeah, not in Petaluma.
Not so much. That's right. You're going to find them primarily in urban centers. And one of the things I learned as UUA president is that the first diversity is age. There's never been a Unitarian Universalist congregation that was significantly diverse in race and class until it was diverse in having a significant presence of young adults.
Youngsters.
Because and this is a hopeful thing, actually. Who puts aside these differences?
Or doesn't see them.
The young do. And so in All Souls, DC, my daughter joined a congregation there that had 500 young adults. She's now the chair of the Committee on Ministry here in San Francisco. She's the CEO of the California Association of Public Hospitals and Health Systems. She works for diversity and equity across class and race lines every day of her life. But she got some of that in a congregation that was urban, in a city that was actually majority minority, where the congregation had 500 young adults and 400 people of color. You're not going to get that everywhere. It's one reason why I believe we need to support our whole denomination. Their transformative urban centers is worth our allyship. And they are also going to help us. Not that we can do everything, and not that we can be an urban church in Petaluma. It ain't going to happen. The challenge for a local congregation is to figure out where your opportunities really lie. I'm going to preach to this on Sunday.
Been forewarned.
Forewarned. Yeah. We need to pay attention.
We're on, Gil.
I guess we're alive here. Yeah.
We need to pay attention
Mhm.
the opportunities that are right there at our front door. And by the way, my experience and that of Reverend Bonnie is that you guys are doing about as great a job as any small congregation I have ever seen anywhere.
Yeah, thanks to Jody and David and Diane.
Well, your leadership, by the way, this needs more. I worry, Bonnie worries, we're going to burn out your leaders
Mhm.
as you grow unless more of you step up.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I'll just say that right out loud.
Yeah.
One of the reasons to grow the congregation is to lessen the burden on the few who have done so much. And I believe that sharing is going to publicly demonstrate that there's more diversity, younger, more racially diverse, varieties of gifts. So let me stop, because my wife always tells me my answers are way too long, and turn to Jan, and then Marie. Jan.
Yeah, well, I just want to speak to the to the eighth principle, because I know I appreciate, John, you're giving a balance, but as a member of the congregation, I can speak freely in favor of it. And I just wanted to call out what you're talking about, the history, and especially that that time when the money was promised and then it was taken back and all. And I think, I mean, personally, I think it would be a disaster if we didn't vote for the eighth principle. I mean, personally, as a writer, I would have much preferred they'd gotten a better editor and it sounded better, but it's like most of the principles, you know, they're not, you know, the kids say it better, you know, everybody's important and everybody gets a say, and, you know, but, you know, so the writing and stuff, but I just think, you know, it's so important that we send the message of standing with and acknowledging white privilege, and that we try to do everything we can. So I'm very happy that we're going to vote as a congregation on the eighth principle in June at the congregational meeting. And I just encourage everyone to vote yes for it. I think it's just essential.
So Jan, I hope you understand that this now has been subsumed in a larger process called the revision of the whole Article 2.
Oh, okay. Oh, so.
And that's what I'm going to get to next week, next month, in the second session.
Oh, okay. So there's not going to be like just an adding.
Yeah, I mean, the congregation can do as it pleases about the proposed eighth principle. But what's going to come before the UUA General Assembly in June is not the eighth principle, but a revision of the whole article in which the principle is embedded. And Paula Cole-Jones, who's the sponsor of the eighth principle from All Souls DC, is part of the Article 2 Commission. And I think she would welcome both an affirmation from Petaluma and an understanding that there's a larger process underway. Now let me turn to Marie.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to remind everybody that just a few steps from our church is the Petaluma Museum, and they have an exhibit about the Blacks for Petaluma Community Development, which has been formed about 40 years ago. And there was so much history in that one little exhibit that I couldn't absorb it all in one visit.
Wow.
It is fantastic. And I would encourage everyone who's interested to go. And that's all I had.
That's fascinating to me, Marie. And because I'm a historian by inclination, I'll see if I can't get over there myself and provide some form of summary.
Okay, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Karen and spouse. Unmute. You need to unmute.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Well, my experience with civil rights and segregation, I was living in Maryland, right next to Washington, D.C., when the whole Board versus the Brown decision was going through the Supreme Court, and the school I was in was desegregated ahead of this. And I wanted to go and play. I wanted to invite, or my mother wanted me to invite a girl who was new to the school to come and play, and her mom didn't feel comfortable with that yet. So that's part of the listening process to the people we're trying to learn from, because we have a lot to learn about what the reality is.
Sure.
And this was brought home to me at a vigil for Tyree Nichols, when a Black mother explained every morning she woke up in Santa Rosa and wondered what challenges she and her child were going to experience that day in Santa Rosa.
Yeah.
So we cannot claim that we live in this nice, liberal, safe county, and it's really not that bad, because it is that bad. And so there's that. And it's interesting, I see that Annalie had her hand up, and I'll let her talk about the other thing. Also, our women's group is going to be doing more research into Universalist women as well as Unitarian women in our history.
Yeah, look into Mary Livermore, who was she was called the queen of the platform in the period after the Civil War. Very eloquent, deeply grounded in anti-racism work. She and her husband, who was a Universalist minister, were based in Chicago during that period, and they led the fundraising that Starr King was involved with for humanitarian research. But Mary Livermore is a much neglected Universalist woman that I very much commend to you. And I just want to say to you also this, that your wise admonition that people of color approaching any kind of interracial engagement are appropriately wary.
Yeah.
It's something that we have to bear in mind. It frankly then behooves us to see what we can do to bring the anxiety level down to a low roar. That's what religion is all about, by the way.
Bringing it down to a low roar or raising up the roof.
Yeah, but it's also about creating a sense of interpersonal safety. How do we talk to one another, human to human? And those of us who inherit privilege and who have it on the basis of gender, wealth, credentials, whatever, I'm very conscious of this. I have to get off my high horse. I can teach here, but if I'm going to talk to somebody about an interracial cooperation, it's inquiry before advocacy. That which is almost always the right way to build any kind of partnership, by the way.
Right.
Definitely.
Well,
tell me about your situation. Tell me about your life.
Still talking.
Yeah.
One other experience I had was,
Hey, Cheryl.
yeah.
Bill wants to say something too.
Oh, sorry.
Phil.
You mentioned Margaret Sanger a little bit earlier in your and I have an anecdote, a family story, that my grandfather received a phone call about 2 a.m. one time when my grandmother had gone to a demonstration with Margaret Sanger, and both of them had gotten arrested. And I don't remember if it was in New York or Boston, but anyway, my grandfather got in the car, went down, and bailed them both out. So it's a combination of activism and white privilege on both sides of the thing here, just as an interesting how it interplayed. Then later on, when my mother was in college, she became a Sangerette, someone who went around and gave birth control information into the Black neighborhoods of Boston, because she was in school at Tufts, which was in Medford, Massachusetts.
That's great.
Well, she didn't think it was great, because she would go back and then find that kids were playing with the diaphragms in the sandbox.
Yes, well.
She got the message through.
They hold quite a bit of water, I think. So
But how much sand? I don't know. Probably have minute holes afterwards.
So when I was minister in New York, I had Alex Sanger, Margaret's grandson, as a congregant. Let's just say that her grandson had moved up in the world. He had married the a daughter of Tom Watson, the founder of IBM.
Right.
They were the only members of the congregation who would not allow, no, maybe not the only, but certainly one of the most prominent members of the congregation who would not allow the picture of the family to appear in the church directory.
Oh.
Because why?
Well, probably just protect the family.
You've got it.
Mhm.
Violent threats, continuous.
Right.
So, those of us who take on these roles of challenging established structures of power and privilege
Oh.
have to also realize that even the people of privilege that we work with have to deal with scary stuff. That this is not easy work. And that's true at every level. From national prominence, think of what just happened to Nancy Pelosi's husband. Jeez Louise.
Mhm.
But it's also true, at the local level. I took on some stuff when I was minister in Knoxville, Tennessee, that resulted in me getting phone calls every night at 3:00 in the morning.
Mhm.
Just to harass me. The congregation that I inherited there, that had started running an interracial day camp from 1949 to 1954, had to put up with their kids being threatened with shotguns and bombs in every time that interracial day camp met. It is tricky and costly to challenge white supremacy and inherited privilege. It has never been easy. It wasn't for the secret six. It wasn't for the people who ran the Underground Railroad, and it won't be in our time either. And will take a lot of crap. Who's on the phone? Who's just at, and it's just, I'm at, yeah. Your name is not up. Try to unmute.
Mary Bivens?
That's EM. But I also noticed that Anzi had her hand up quite a bit and was trying to get.
Coach Jody, you're a good moderator. Let me go to Anzi, and then we'll come back to EM. Is that okay when you can figure out how to unmute EM? Anzi.
Oh, well, I wanted to make a couple of comments.
Sure.
One, when I was in the 70s, after I was divorced and I moved to a city, instead of moving to the suburbs, I moved to Milwaukee. I decided to move right into the middle of the city. And the reason was exactly what you would know, so that my kids would be going to school with at least maybe half of their class being Black. And I was very proud of that. My children did say to me, there were some problems with that. They had a lot of, it was a whole different one. Not with the fact that it was Black, but the fact that in that community of it being the middle of a big urban city, there was a lot of other things that went on, a lot of drugs, of course, in the 70s and things like that. But that's one way. It's hard to do here, but that is one way that begins to change things. Because if you notice, even in our congregation, the younger people have a very different way. They have grown up differently, and I don't think they have some of the biases that we had or some of the concerns that we had, So anyway, that was one thing. The second thing, and this is for you, John, I lived in the community next where Peter Morales lived in Sequim. He lived in Sequim, Washington. And so I was just heartbroken.
Yeah.
When he felt he had to resign, and he was so honorable about the way he did it. He said, I was mistaken. It's time for me to go. And that was a very difficult thing in our community because of the fact that we felt so committed to him. And he made an offhand comment, which is why he decided he had to go. But here's a man who had what, 6 adopted children or 6 foster children. I mean, a really wonderful gentleman in his own way. And the final thing I want to say is that for those of you that are so pro the 8th principle, listen to what John said. It is all the principles, if this goes ahead, are going to be subsumed by what happens at GA. Because what they're intending to do, I'm totally opposed to it. And the congregation I come from before is absolutely opposed to it. They're going to be subsumed into a whole bunch of what I call balloons. Their values. And they look, love, compassion, that kind of thing. And they want to subsume all the principles into it. And if you like the principles, which I do, because you can tick them off like on an elevator, and they really resonate with me, and they have for years, both the principles and the sources. But what I was going to say is, I hope you address that next time, because I think it's a very critical issue. And I move into this community, coming from a community that has incredible, intense feelings on both sides of this that haven't even emerged in our community here at all. So
tell me, Anzi, where were you before?
Port Townsend, Washington.
Oh, okay, very good.
The minister, by the way, the minister of that, whose name is Bruce Bodie, knows you, of course.
Yes, and his successor, Kate Lohr, as well.
Yeah. And Kate Lohr is gone now, as you know. But anyway, he's a marvelous minister. I was hoping he would be here and could come Sunday, but he's coming on Monday instead. He can't. He's on his way through town right now.
Well, give him my best. I know Bruce quite well.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for this witness, Anzi, because you're lifting up one of the key things that will be discussed next week, or next month, actually, I think it is, isn't it? Our next meeting is on a Sunday night rather than a midweek. I hope that the recording of this will be available to people, because this has been a bit of a hash. But we're going to try to talk about the process and the Article 2 Commission, which is replicating the commission that in 1985 came up with the new Statement of Principles and Purposes. I think is trying to do their best to incorporate the desires of the 8th principle, but there are mixed opinions about the process. There always are, and about the verbiage we use are just focused on wordsmithing.
No.
The whole thing will be a little bit complicated to understand. Now let me go back to our friend who was on the phone. EM, is that you?
Yes. I've been having a lot of tech glitches. So I came in. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I missed a fair bit at the beginning. And unfortunately, I'll miss next month. How are you making these recordings available? Because I'm very interested in this.
Well, I titled this whole thing "Our Imperfect History." I think our ability to share this stuff is going to be somewhat imperfect. I have a stack of slides that I had wanted to show this evening.
Mm-hmm.
That I will try to distribute to everyone who's signed up for the whole course. I will also make available an opportunity to do at least an hour of inquiry with me following this for people who are not able to participate this evening.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry. I don't know if I signed up for this course or not. I can't remember. Was something sent out that I could sign up for?
No, we didn't have a sign up for it. It's just gone out as a general invitation. So we will need to, get our mechanism in place for sharing recordings and the slides. And I think we'll have to work with Kevin on that. But
okay.
Yeah.
I love history, and I've really enjoyed what I heard. So thank you very much.
So my little chronometer here tells me that we've gone about 10 minutes beyond the appointed time, and I believe that we should be good stewards of everything. Karen,
No.
do I see your hand up still?
Yes.
I do want to say, Reverend John, we did put on the invitation that went out 6:30 to 8:30 just to give
Okay,
plenty
good.
of time. So there is that.
Karen. You need to unmute, Karen.
This is my consistent problem, sorry. Jeanette asked that we put the upcoming dates in the chat. Can we do that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
let me
I
see
can
if
do
I
that.
can just.
I can do it. I can.
Good. Yeah, the next session is intended to focus more on the principles and purposes process. But I thought it was important for us to just review generally that for a long time we UUs, with some imperfections, have been pushing in the direction of inclusivity and anti-oppression. And unless you understand that background, including the way in which, when the denomination was formed in the 1960s, the principles and purposes were first formed and then revised in reaction primarily to feminism. You can't understand how we have been gradually unfolding our commitment to people. Yes. So the next session is on Sunday, March the 19th from 4 to 6 p.m. And then on April the 19th, in Massachusetts, that's Patriots Day.
Also,
From 6:30 to 8:30. And then finally, the attempt will be on the 7th of May for us to have an in-person potluck to summarize some of these reflections about the eighth principle, our commitment to anti-racism, the whole process that lies before the association these days, and well before the General Assembly that arrives in June. I hope that's helpful. I tried to design this thing that would be as accessible as possible, and that if only technology would cooperate with us a little bit more, all would be well. But I thank all of you who've taken part this evening. If there's one last intervention or question, I'll take it before we sign off. Yes, Christina. Unmute.
Okay, I just want to thank you for the history, and everybody, several people have said that, because as brand new to UU as I am, it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. And I don't know how many here tonight. I grew up in Southern Marin, born in San Francisco. We moved to Marin in 1952. And my mother had a friend. My mother had her second baby in San Francisco. Her roommate was a Black woman who lived in Marin City. And so they became friends because her daughter was my age. And so we would often visit there because they didn't have a car. But I remember the dirt roads and the shacks that those families lived in. And I was just a toddler, and I have pretty vivid memories and how sad that made me then. And I didn't understand it. So I feel grateful that I was raised by parents that were brave enough to share that with us, to allow us to be a part of that. But anyway, I was going to say something about, well, anyway, I'm looking forward to the process and how this all happens, because I've been in 2 previous UCC churches where we did open and affirming, which was, it's okay for gay people to be here. And those were brutal in both of them, to work through that process. So I'm really curious to see how this all works out. But at this point, I'm very positive about the eighth principle. So just thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Let me just say that at the risk of self-promotion, although I think the scripture says that he who tooteth not his own horn, the same shall not be tooted for him. I have lifted up some of my previous writing that's relevant to all of this. There's a little book I did way back in 2011 called Universalists and Unitarians in America, A People's History. I drew on some of that for some of this summary this evening. And then in 2020, I published a book entitled Conflagration: How the Transcendentalists sparked the American struggle for racial, gender, and social justice. And I recommended those for reading tonight. They're hardly required, but for people who are new to our movement, who want to refresh their understanding of where we come from and what we've struggled with along the way, those are both valuable resources. And then finally, for next week, my most basic introduction to Unitarian Universalism was published way back in 1989. It's called Our Chosen Faith, An Introduction to Unitarian Universalism. No good deed ever goes unpunished in our midst. That's what got me sentenced to 8 years as denominational president. And Cheryl, you raised your hand again.
I'm sorry. One quick question I forgot to say. When I was doing my research for the women's group, it said that Unitarian and Universalists were Christian. So if you could just quickly address that.
Yeah, absolutely. So both are on the Unitarian and Universalist sides of the family. In the 19th century, almost everyone considered themselves a liberal Christian. And what that meant for them was that they wanted to follow the religion of Jesus without necessarily adopting all of the creeds about him. Okay?
Okay.
And they were open to parallel insights from other traditions. This is the Transcendentalists especially, that suggested that the way we treat one another is more important than the way we formulate our stated beliefs. So the thread figure in my book about the Transcendentalists, James Freeman Clarke, is a revolutionary reformer in how churches organize themselves. Everything he did, we now take for granted. Women can preach. Everybody who gives a little bit of their time and energy can be a member and vote. The congregation should get together not just for Sunday morning, but to reflect on what do we need to do in the world. That wasn't common practice until James Freeman Clarke came along. His church was called the Church of the Disciples. He wanted people to follow the religion of Jesus. But he became the first professor of comparative religion anywhere on the planet, because he wrote essays on Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, and he wanted us to take into account the insights from other traditions. So this is the groundwork that we build upon. I still think that there needs to be a core of our movement that is devoted to, well, Theodore Parker, who was a radical transcendentalist, said that there were two dimensions to religion: the ethical, which is the horizontal, and the vertical. The vertical has to do with how we are going to decide to live in the face of the fact that we're all going to die. We need to deepen our spirits, and live more fully in the time that is ours. That's a major message of my sermon on Sunday. Because only if we are courageous enough to face the fact that we, like all of us, are mortal, are we going to have the bandwidth to embrace others in the time that is ours, and to be courageous and more embracing and more ethical in our living. These are the two great dimensions of the religious life. Summed up, said our forebearers, in the two great commandments. Love what they called God, the ground of our being, with all of your heart, mind, and soul, because you're lucky to be here. And then love your neighbor as yourself. Even the one you don't know, who's not like you.
I can hardly wait to get there on Sunday, John.
We'll hear
That sounds so wonderful. But I do have to say, along with Cheryl's point, I think it would be helpful. I was with Jody when someone said, now, is this a Christian church? You know, if it is, I don't know if I like it. And so I would say that my minister used to say we were a very liberal Christian church.
Yeah, well,
you need to help us with that. I think you need to help us.
The issue here, Ozzy, is we are more than, but we should never be less than.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. See you Sunday.
Okay,
Reverend John,
Thank you.
where can we get your books? How do we get your books?
UUA bookstore.
Thank
go
you.
to the UUA, yeah. In Spirit is the title of the bookstore. They've got them all.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank
peace.
you.
thanks for coming, everybody. Tell
Bye.